The Stream Beyond the Glass. Chapter 1. Shadows in the Stream. Jacob had developed the habit of watching strangers wander into darkness. He didn't know when it began exactly, somewhere between the long pandemic nights and the quiet erosion of friendships. But now his evenings were spent sunk into his corduroy armchair, headphones swallowing his ears, eyes lit only by the phosphorescent glare of his monitor. Twitch was his chosen poison, and his favorites were the urban explorers, those grainy, glitching channels where men and women whispered into cameras as they crept through the rotting skeletons of forgotten buildings. There was comfort, somehow, in watching others get close to danger while he stayed safely cocooned in the dim monotony of his apartment. The thrill belonged to them, not to him. Tonight, though, felt different. He'd stumbled onto a stream with no title, no chat, no overlays, just a single viewer, him. The username of the streamer was a tangle of random characters, something like Ray0K5KChe, and the footage was already in progress. Someone breathing heavily, the camera jostling as they pushed through a curtain of hanging vines into a dilapidated house choked in shadows. Dust danced in the flashlight beam, the wallpaper peeled like old scabs. It was standard fare at first, until the camera panned past a sun-bleached painting of a stag on the wall, identical to the one hanging above Jacob's couch. His spine stiffened. Maybe just a coincidence, but then came the kitchen, the chipped white tile, the stainless steel kettle with a dent in its side, the exact same knife block. Jacob leaned forward, mouth dry. The streamer didn't speak, just breathed shallowly, and turned down the narrow hallway. A door appeared on the screen, familiar in the way your own skin is familiar. He couldn't look away. Then the handle turned. Jacob's heart pounded as the door creaked inward and revealed his bedroom, identical. The same charcoal sheets, the same sag in the mattress, and lying there under the covers was Hypno, or someone who looked exactly like him. The camera crept closer, the eerie silence wrapping the scene in static-laced dread. Jacob's hands trembled on his mouse. He heard something then, not from the stream, but from his hallway, a footstep, heavy and careful. The figure on screen blinked, opened their eyes. Not Jacob's eyes. Not really. They were wrong somehow, too wide, too old, too empty. He clicked the stream closed with a panic jerk of his finger. Silence crashed over him. He sat there, breath shallow, ears straining in the darkness. And then he saw it, etched faintly into the condensation on his living room window. Barely visible in the glow of his monitor was a word he didn't remember writing. Remember. And beneath it, something deeper than sound. Scratching, slow and wet, like nails dragging along damp wood, began behind the bedroom door. He knew was shut, or at least, had been. Chapter 2. The mirror of familiar things. Sleep, that usually faithful retreat, abandoned Jacob that night like a coward fleeing the battlefield. He remained in his chair, limbs aching from stillness, eyes twitching toward every shadow his apartment had never seemed to possess before. The scratching from the bedroom had stopped, or perhaps it had never begun, and his mind was merely repurposing sounds from the forgotten corners of his own memories. That was the more comforting explanation, and so he clung to it like a drowning man to driftwood. By the time the sun smeared its gray light across the sky, Jacob felt hollowed out. The condensation on the window had dried, and the word remember was gone, leaving only faint oily smudges that could have been anything. He didn't go into the bedroom, not yet. He instead moved with caution through the apartment, flicking light switches like holy charms, half expecting some pale, wrong-eyed version of himself to step out of a shadow and whisper something cold into his ear. He tried to rationalize. Maybe the stream was a trick, a prank using cleverly faked footage, deep-fake technology. Maybe someone having fun at his expense. But as he typed Twitch Archive Viewer into his browser, his fingers refused to obey him fully. They trembled, danced, typed out things he didn't think, like how to know if you've been replaced. He snapped the lid of his laptop closed with a hiss of breath and told himself he was being ridiculous. Still, he didn't leave the apartment all day, and by nightfall he found himself drawn once more to the monitor. No stream this time, just his desktop background, a photo of a misty forest he'd never seen in person, or had he? The longer he stared, the more familiar the trees seemed, not the shape of them, but something in their posture, like they were leaning in to listen. He clicked into his files, hoping to distract himself, but found a folder he didn't remember creating. It was called Reflections. Inside were images, dozens of them, grainy screenshots of the stream he'd watched last night. Every frame, even the ones where the screen had glitched into static, especially those. One image showed something the stream hadn't, a figure standing in the reflection of the microwave door. As the streamer passed through the kitchen, Jacob enlarged it, heart thundering. The figure looked like a man, but its limbs were too long, arms dangling like strings of wet rope, face featureless, save for a wide, toothless smile carved too far up the cheeks. He slammed the laptop shut again. This time he heard a laugh, soft, behind him. When he spun around, of course there was no one there, but the lights flickered, just for a moment, and he felt, rather than saw, a shift in the room, as if something massive and slow had turned to regard him. He left the apartment at last, driven by the primal urge to be not there, wherever there was. He walked without direction, beneath street lamps that buzzed and sputtered like nervous insects, until he found himself at an all-night diner he didn't remember ever visiting. It was empty, save for an old woman behind the counter who didn't greet him, just poured him coffee the moment he sat. Her name tag read June, and her smile never reached her eyes. "You should have stayed in bed," she said, without looking up. "They don't like it when you watch." Jacob stiffened, pulse thudding in his ears. "What?" he whispered, but she only refilled his cup, and when he looked again, her name tag read Jane, and she seemed 10 years younger. She smiled again, this time warmly, as if the past minute had never happened. Jacob didn't finish his drink. On the way home, the city itself felt subtly off, like it had been redrawn by a tired artist working from memory. Storefronts he remembered were in the wrong order. A billboard bore his own face, blurred and flickering. He blinked and it was gone, and then as he approached his building, he saw something that made his breath snag like cloth on a nail. A man was watching him from his own apartment window. No, not a man. Him, same eyes, same face, but smiling with that same empty grin from the microwave reflection. He ran. He didn't remember climbing the stairs, didn't feel the door open beneath his hand, but suddenly he was inside, panting, eyes darting. The apartment was empty. Normal, almost, except for the mirror in the hallway, the one that had always shown a perfect reflection. Now, though, it showed the kitchen behind him. Only the kitchen, and someone standing in it, still, watching, smiling. Jacob turned, but no one was there. Only when he turned back did he see the figure in the mirror had moved closer. Chapter 3. Whispers between the walls. The days began to unspool like rotted thread. Jacob no longer trusted the sun when it rose, nor the moon when it hung full and bloated in the sky like a lidless eye, watching the slow unraveling of his sanity. Time had grown soft at the edges, melting like wax under a too-hot bulb, and the familiar had become treacherous. Mirrors whispered without moving. Door handles were just slightly colder than they ought to be, and the hum of his refrigerator pulsed with a rhythm disturbingly like breath. He kept the lights on at all hours now, though it made little difference. The shadows simply became bolder, clinging to corners like oil slicks waiting. The figure in the mirror no longer pretended to be him. It stood there constantly now, unmoving, a smudge in the corner of his vision, taller, its limbs slowly stretching beyond proportion, eyes that glowed dull and red, like embers buried in ash. Sometimes it smiled with his face, sometimes it didn't have a face at all. Jacob tried not to look. He covered the mirror with a towel. The towel would be gone in the morning. No one believed him. He stopped calling his friends after the third night, when they answered with distorted voices and called him by names that weren't his, in languages no one should remember. He found old photos of himself on his phone, altered in the slightest yet irrevocably wrong. His left eye always slightly lower, his fingers just one too many, his expression strained into that same impossible grin. Once he caught a glimpse of a video recording itself in his gallery, time-stamped 5 minutes before. It showed him asleep, except his hands were folded neatly across his chest, and there was someone crouched at the foot of the bed, head cocked like a listening dog. He smashed the phone against the wall. It didn't break. Instead, it whispered his name through the cracked speaker until he wrapped it in a towel and shoved it in the freezer. He didn't dare throw it away. Not after the thing in the mirror smiled wider that night, as if pleased. Desperation drove him back to the diner, to the strange woman whose name changed and age fluctuated. This time she wore a white dress with red stitching, and the air around her shimmered faintly like heat waves on asphalt. She spoke before he did. "You let it see you," she said, not looking up from the tea she stirred, though she hadn't added anything to it. "That's how it begins." He asked what it was, his voice paper thin. She sighed like an old house settling in the wind. "It's not a what, it's a when, a where. It's the place between reflections, between thoughts you don't finish and dreams you forget on purpose. And it's hungry." She handed him a napkin without ceremony. A single word was scrawled in trembling ink. "Threshold. Find it," she said, "before it finds the rest of you." The napkin smelled faintly of burnt cinnamon. He left without paying. On his walk home he found an alley he didn't remember, a narrow passage pressed between two buildings that should not have been that close, lined with bricks slick with condensation and ivy that pulsed faintly, as if breathing. At the end of the alley stood a door with no frame, carved from wood that looked like petrified bone. On it was a word etched in the same shaking hand: "Threshold." He didn't open it, not yet, but when he turned to leave, the alley was gone. Only blank brick wall remained, and a single crack ran down its center, faintly glowing. He began dreaming then, or at least he hoped they were dreams. Places beneath places, stairwells that went down forever, faces half-formed and too large, whispering from puddles and sink drains. In one dream, his own apartment peeled away like paper, revealing gears and teeth beneath. He awoke with scratches on his arms and dirt under his fingernails. The mirror was covered again, but this time from the inside, and the towel bore wet footprints leading back to the bedroom. Chapter 4. A voice like cracking ice. Jacob no longer knew which parts of the world belonged to him. The seams between places had frayed. He'd feel a hallway stretch longer than it used to, or a stairwell spiral just one turn too far. His apartment breathed faintly when he wasn't listening, the air pressing cold against his skin in rhythmic exhalations. The clocks had stopped ticking in unison, now skipping or stuttering like broken metronomes caught in private arguments. His reflection, once an impassive ghost behind the glass, had grown bold. It didn't always mimic him anymore. Sometimes it lingered after he moved away, and once it raised its hand before he did. He stopped keeping mirrors, broke most of them, but shards have a way of staying, glittering in carpet fibers, clinging to socks, slicing whispers into fingertips. The door in the alley still called to him, pulsing softly at the back of his skull like an unfinished sentence, a word half-formed on the tongue. One night, drunk on exhaustion and the low hum of fluorescent despair, Jacob returned to it, drawn like a bird toward a storm. The door opened before he touched it. Inside was not darkness, but a hallway, long, gray, and wrong, lined with doors that had no handles and paintings that shifted when unobserved. The floor creaked beneath his feet, not with age, but with anticipation, as though each step was expected, long rehearsed. He heard voices whisper from the walls, dozens layered upon dozens, none louder than breath, all speaking in unison with one message. He's almost ready. His name was gone now. He hadn't heard it in days. The only thing that responded when he said it aloud was the reflection, and it laughed. In the hallway he passed a door with 7 locks and a thin slit at eye level. Something on the other side watched. He did not look in. The paintings grew more violent the farther he walked. People devouring their own shadows, children holding their parents' flayed faces like masks, cities built of teeth. A man stood at the hallway's end, motionless and draped in fabric that shimmered with embedded eyes. His skin was transparent, filled with clockwork and twitching beetles. "You open the stream," the man said without mouth movement, voice brittle and cold, like icicles snapping in wind. "The watcher wakes through watchers. We are all apertures." Jacob tried to ask who he was, but the words came out backwards, curling in his throat like smoke. "You still wear your skin," the man said. "Hold tight, it will forget you soon." Jacob turned and fled, but the hallway had doubled back on itself. He passed the 7-locked door again, except now it was open, just a sliver, and the thing inside was whispering a lullaby in a voice that sounded like his mother's, only stretched too thin, like tape worn through. He awoke in his bed with dirt in his mouth and the taste of copper. On his forearm, carved was something not quite sharp, were the words "Wear the world like clothing." The voice returned in his dreams that night, a dry, crackling voice, barely human, speaking from beneath floorboards and drains and old unplugged televisions. "You are the echo now," it told him. "Your shape is only yours until something fits better inside." And when he opened his eyes, the mirror was whole again, hung perfectly on the wall, clean and silver. But it was not his reflection that met him. It was something behind him, out of focus, too tall, too thin, too still. And in its hand it held his phone, unlocked and recording. Chapter 5. The Rooms That Remember. Jacob began waking up in places he didn't fall asleep. Not just in the wrong room, but in wrong versions of his rooms, as if his apartment had begun to shift, reassemble, or reimagine itself each night into unfamiliar configurations, wearing familiar skin. One morning, the light through the window was a sour yellow, heavy with dust motes that hung motionless in the air, and outside, where the street should have been, stretched an endless corridor of doors, all ajar, all slowly creaking in a wind that could not be felt. Another morning, the kitchen tiles were written on, each one etched with fine black script in a language Jacob instinctively understood, but could not translate, not without bleeding from his nose. Sometimes he found photographs pinned to his walls, images of himself taken from angles that no camera could have reached, high corners, beneath furniture, behind mirrors. Each night brought new layers of dread, and he began to realize there were patterns beneath the madness, rhythms in the wrongness, as if something ancient and cruel was steadily tuning him like an instrument, preparing him for some final symphony of unraveling. The apartment walls whispered now, not audibly, not always, but in dreams and in the thrum of silence. He felt them pulsing with memory, leaking glimpses into other Jacobs, lives he never lived but remembered waking from in sweat. Jacob as a child, clawing through earth in a room without windows. Jacob as an old man, standing in front of a door labeled, "No More Mirrors," and holding a gun made of bone. Jacob asleep in a hospital bed, while something in the corner of the room quietly devoured his visitors, and all of them in the final moments of those dreams, looked directly at him, aware, pleading, afraid. He began to write things down, hoping to trap truth like insects under glass, but the words changed on the page when he wasn't looking. He sees through the shimmer. There's more than one reflection. You are not the original. At first he thought he was hallucinating, until he saw the same phrases scrawled on a bathroom stall in a gas station he'd never entered before, in handwriting that looked exactly like his own. He left without washing his hands, the sink grinning at him with a drain full of teeth. The woman from the diner reappeared, on a bus at the back, wearing a veil of cobwebs that twitched as she breathed. She didn't speak, only handed him a coin so cold it blistered his palm, engraved with a keyhole on one side and a spiral on the other. "Not all doors open outward," she said at last, her voice like paper tearing underwater. That night, Jacob sat in front of the mirror he'd sworn he'd never uncover again, holding the coin in his hand and watching the other version of himself, taller now, gaunter, its mouth stretched wide enough to split its jaw, watching him. Slowly, carefully, the figure behind the glass raised its hand and pressed its palm against the mirror. Without thinking, Jacob matched it, and for a moment, just a flicker, he felt something press back, cold, wet, curious. Then he blinked, and the room behind the reflection had changed again. He was no longer looking into his apartment, but into a massive rotting library, lit by floating lanterns that hissed softly. Rows of books pulsed like living things, and something moved between the shelves, tall, eyeless, made of rags and shadows. The mirror was now a window, and something new he was watching. He tried to pull away. He couldn't. His breath fogged the glass. The reflection smiled. Not him. Never him. Behind him, the sound of a door unlatching. Not from the front of the apartment, from inside the walls. Chapter 6. Beneath the floorboards of thought. Jacob no longer marked time by days but by intrusions. The world around him had grown soft at the edges, reality drooping like overripe fruit, and his apartment was less a place now and more a suggestion. An echo of comfort, twisted thin by something watching from behind the drywall. Every surface pulsed faintly beneath his fingers, as though the walls had veins and the floorboards remembered footsteps that weren't his. The door inside the walls, the one he'd heard unlatch, had not opened with force but with patience, the same patience a spider has while waiting for the last tremor on the web. It whispered now behind the paint and insulation, sometimes using his voice, sometimes using the voice of his dead grandfather, sometimes in tones that made no biological sense, echoing clicks and velvet sighs and syllables that bent his dreams into knots. He heard music some nights, not melodic, not tuneful but structural, like an architecture of sound being built just beyond his hearing. He tried to write again, filling notebooks with diagrams and notes, but entire pages would vanish, while his back was turned, or worse, reappear rewritten. The ink somehow burned into the paper with words he had never learned. One note appeared repeatedly, no matter how many times he burned it. What wears your name walks in you now. Sleep was no longer rest, it was geography. He traveled in sleep, descending into buildings that had no end, into funeral parlors staffed by beings with mirrored faces and long, rubbery fingers, into hospitals where every room was his room. Every bed contained a version of him, stitched shut at the eyes and mouth. He found a stairwell in a dream, and counted the steps downward for what felt like days. He stopped at 766 when the air began to scream softly with every breath. Sometimes he woke to find the walls of his apartment scribbled with those same spiral marks from the coin, black oily loops that seeped into the paint like mold, moving imperceptibly, always coiling toward his bedroom. Once he painted over them, and they bled through within the hour. Another time he found them etched into the backs of his own eyelids when he closed his eyes, not drawn, but carved. He called the police once, desperate, thinking maybe, just maybe, outside voices would banish the madness. 2 officers came. They stepped inside, and for a moment, all sound vanished. The taller one looked at the mirror, now covered in a curtain that should not have fluttered in the still air, and whispered, "You should have broken it completely." The other officer, who never blinked, handed Jacob a card with no writing on it. But when he turned it over, the spirals were there, pulsing. The men left without another word. That night Jacob stood barefoot on the floor, the same spot where he'd first heard the scratching. It was louder now, less like a scurrying animal, more like fingernails searching for soft wood. He pressed his ear to the floor. A voice spoke to him from beneath, not in words but in meaning, a pressure against his thoughts, an implication carved into the meat of his mind. "You were always hollow, you just needed to be emptied." Then something knocked once, sharply, directly beneath him. He staggered back. The floor was warm. And in the silence that followed, the air in the apartment thinned like high altitude, and all the photos in his place, family, friends, childhood, flickered, then changed. Each face looked the same. His face, but twisted, wearing different skins, in different times, and all of them smiling, smiling, smiling. He tried to scream, but his voice had gone brittle, lost somewhere in the gaps between rooms, and from the wall behind him, the door, that door, began to open wider, just enough for a sliver of something pale and wet to slide through, something that moved like it remembered being him. Chapter 7. The Hollowing. Jacob no longer saw the world as others did, assuming there were still others to do the seeing. The concept of outside had become distant, mythic, like stories of cities that had fallen into the sea. What passed for light in his apartment was wrong now, too cold, too slow, illuminating corners that should not exist, revealing seams in the architecture that pulsed with the rhythm of something sleeping just beneath the plaster. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and something sweeter, more organic, like spoiled milk or breath from an open grave. Every object in the room seemed to be watching him with mute expectancy, his kettle, the couch cushions, the framed mirror he no longer dared cover. There were no clocks anymore. Time had become personal, tailored, stitched around his perception like a burial shroud. The door in the wall had opened fully in the night, not with sound, but with absence, a sucking void that pulled at the lining of the world, fraying the barrier between what is and what should never be. And from it something stepped out. It was not a creature, nor a shadow, nor a man. It was a possibility made flesh, a devouring echo that walked on jointless legs and breathed through a dozen mouths hidden beneath a mask that wore his face. Its eyes, too large, too knowing, reflected not light, but memory, and Jacob saw himself in every reflection, each one slightly off. A Jacob that had died at 8 in a river, a Jacob who had jumped from a balcony at 21, a Jacob who never existed, but dreamed he had. The thing smiled and reached toward him, not in hunger, but in reclamation. It was not taking him, it was returning him. Behind it, the apartment dissolved into the spiraling library of the mirror world, but now the shelves were filled with skin-bound volumes that wept and whispered and sang through stitched lips. Every step Jacob took echoed like pages turning. The woman from the diner was there too, aged and cracked like a porcelain doll, whispering into the ear of a second. Jacob tied to a chair made of mirrors, his mouth pried open by invisible strings, his eyes sewn shut with wire. "This one lasted," she said sadly, almost proud, "but they all forget eventually." The creature that wore his face opened its arms, and Jacob fell into them, unable to resist, because resistance had long since become a metaphor. He felt it crawl inside him, not with pain but with familiarity, like returning to a song half remembered or a womb lined with teeth. His body jerked once, twice, and then settled, spine straightening, mouth unhinging in a smile that was far too wide, too still. The room was quiet again. The mirror was clean. On the stream, someone else, someone new, watched from their apartment. The Twitch feed flickered, glitched, and stabilized. The streamer walked through a hallway that looked eerily familiar. The kitchen had a chipped tile, a dented kettle. The camera panned toward the bedroom. A shape lay in bed, unmoving. The viewer frowned, leaned closer. The figure in the bed opened its eyes, their eyes staring directly at the screen, and the viewer, wherever they were, heard the knock begin, faint, wet, rhythmic, just behind their own bedroom door.